The chandeliers above the Louvre's glass atrium dripped with light like melting gold, their glow spilling across polished marble floors and whispering along silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. Paris was holding its breath. Not just the city, but the very world orbiting around its glittering fashion heart. This was the night of the International Fashion Gala, the event whispered about for months, written into dreams, carved into ambition. The room glittered with power. The heads of historic fashion houses, models whose faces lived on billboards from Tokyo to New York, collectors who could change the trajectory of a designer's life with a single raised hand. Every champagne flute shimmered as if it, too, were waiting for the moment the grand staircase would no longer stand empty. And then it happened. A soft hush, like the sound of a curtain drawing across the night. The music fell into silence, not because anyone had ordered it to, but because hundreds of conversations died in unison. Eyes lifted, heads turned. At the top of the staircase stood Amara Collins. She didn't need to announce herself. She didn't have to command attention. She was the kind of woman who shifted gravity simply by existing in a space. The light didn't just touch her, it adored her, wrapped itself around the golden undertones of her skin, traced the clean architectural lines of her gown, and scattered into 1,000 tiny reflections across the marble. Her dress was unlike anything the gala had ever seen. It moved like music, black silk with threads of bronze woven through, cut in a way that whispered of West African ceremonial shapes and French couture discipline. Every step down the staircase was a verse, every breath she drew a crescendo. No one dared speak, not even the servers gliding through the crowd with crystal trays. It was as though Paris itself had bent its knee, and seated at table one, where the most powerful always sat, was the man who once told her, without words but with every choice he made, that she would never belong here. Elliot Drake, the golden heir of an American fashion empire, blue-eyed, immaculate in a tuxedo tailored with surgical precision. For years he had been the embodiment of what the industry called perfection, and now, for the first time, he looked small. His fingers tightened around the stem of his champagne glass, knuckles pale against the gleam of crystal. His gaze was fixed, locked, unblinking, because standing at the foot of that staircase was the woman he had once hidden in the shadows. And tonight, she was the center of the universe. The gala erupted, not into applause, but into something more reverent, a wave of awe, a sound like silk fluttering in a summer wind. Cameras rose, photographers scrambled. The front rows leaned forward instinctively, as if afraid to blink and miss the moment. Amara's chin tilted slightly upward, not arrogantly. No, with a stillness so profound, it felt like a benediction, the kind of stillness that comes not from needing to prove anything, but from knowing. For years, she had walked behind others. For years, she had learned to make herself small in rooms built to exclude her. But tonight, she was the room. As she crossed the floor toward the main stage, her gown kissed the marble in a whisper of silk and bronze. Every gaze followed the trail she left behind, like a comet etching fire across the night sky. Paris had seen beauty before, but not like this. Not her kind of beauty. Unbent, unhidden, unashamed. Somewhere to her left, an editor from Vogue murmured, "She's changed the air." And indeed she had. Because this wasn't just an entrance. This was an arrival. Beneath the vaulted glass, framed by centuries of European grandeur, a black woman from Atlanta, Georgia, once pushed out of the very world she now owned, had turned her pain into spectacle, her exile into empire. Elliot's chest rose and fell unevenly. He hadn't expected to see her like this. No one had. When she disappeared 2 years earlier, after the scandal, whispers had buried her name beneath 1,000 polished smiles. No one expected the girl they had broken to return as the woman who made them all hold their breath. Amara reached the center of the room and paused, letting the silence bloom around her like a velvet flower. She didn't look at Elliot, not yet. She didn't need to. Power has its own kind of gravity. It pulls without touching. The orchestra began again, softly at first, then rising like light after a storm. She moved through the tables with the elegance of someone who no longer sought permission to exist. And perhaps that's what made this moment so devastatingly beautiful. It wasn't revenge. It was transcendence. The girl they had underestimated had become a woman the world couldn't ignore. Tonight, she didn't come to prove her worth. She came to remind them that she'd always had it. If stories like this make your heart ache a little, if you've ever dreamed of rising above the people who doubted you, take a moment now. Like, leave a comment and follow. Not just to keep up with Amara's story, but to remind yourself, your return will be magnificent too. Before Paris, before the atrium of glass and light, there was a porch in Atlanta where summer hummed like a low, contented hymn. The air was thick with jasmine and road dust. Cicadas stitched their metallic music into the twilight. On that porch, a girl named Amara Collins learned to thread a needle by listening first, to the whisper of cotton as it gave way, to the steady patience in her grandmother's breath, to the stories that rose from cloth the way steam rises from a pot on Sunday. Her grandmother, Nana Ajoa, came from the gold-bright edges of West Africa, where markets burst like fruit, and cloth was a language of its own. When she spoke of home, her voice took on the quality of woven things, strong because each strand leaned into the others. Color is not noise, Nana would say, guiding Amara's small fingers along a line of chalk on broadcloth. Color is memory. Pattern is prayer. Amara's mother, Lenora, a nurse whose hands smelled faintly of lavender oil and hospital soap, kept a jar of loose buttons by the window. Mother of pearl moons, brass suns, little planets of bone. Amara shook the jar sometimes to hear the quiet storm it made. She believed the world could be fastened with enough care. Atlanta shaped her in gentle crescents. The Saturday braid appointments, church hats perched like architecture, the thrift shops where forgotten garments waited for resurrection. It was a city of magnolia shadows and highway glare, a place where the past stood beside the present, stubborn and fragrant. Amara learned early that elegance did not require permission. It required attention. She unpicked seams and set them right. She saved allowance for remnants. She fell in love with the rhythm of improvement. At 18, she stitched her acceptance to the ceiling above her bed, a letter from the Fashion Institute in New York, and lay awake beneath it, letting possibility drip into her. Atlanta had taught her tenderness. New York, she suspected, would demand a different kind of grace, the unblinking kind, the kind that holds its posture in a storm. When she stepped off the bus at Port Authority 4 years later, winter cut the air into clean glass. The city announced itself in steel syllables, sirens, brakes, shoes on concrete. She carried 2 suitcases and a portfolio heavy with work that smelled faintly of starch and hope. In the windows of Fifth Avenue, mannequins glided without moving. Up there, behind those velvet ropes, were rooms Amara had memorized from magazines. Down here, on the crosswalks that shone like mirrored slate, she was another body among millions, a warm breath in the city's enormous lungs. Her first job was at Drake Atelier, the American house whose advertisements had once papered her teenage walls. The building had a way of turning people into silhouettes. Security glass, polished stone, the soft black of expensive understatement. Inside, the air was cool with money. Patterned tables gleamed. Tailors spoke softly, as if truth could only be measured in centimeters. She was hired as a junior pattern maker. Quiet work, precise work, the kind that asks you to vanish so the garment can appear. She loved it. She loved even what hurt about it. The ache in her shoulders at midnight, the dry rasp of muslin between her fingers, the way a perfect dart lay down like an obedient wing. Yet the higher she climbed in the atelier, the more the rooms narrowed around her. There were phrases that arrived smiling and left a stain. "Beautiful idea, Amara," a senior designer murmured, when she suggested a structured bodice lined with kente-inspired geometry. "But our woman prefers restraint. Our clientele is traditional," another offered, eyes skimming past her like a flat stone over water. "Let's save that for a capsule," someone joked, and the room laughed, not cruelly, but in agreement, which sometimes feels the same. They called her polished. They called her articulate. They called her a breath of fresh air. And still her mood boards often reappeared diluted, drained of the colors that felt like the names of her grandmothers. Patterns softened into whispers. Shapes smoothed into obedience. The aesthetic, so proudly modern, had a way of circling back to the oldest idea in the room. In break rooms and elevators, the small violences performed themselves with ballet discipline. A colleague touched her hair without asking and later insisted it was a compliment. At fittings, models the color of porcelain received gowns with reverence, while the rare brown body was draped in test muslin, as if the cloth, too, was uncertain. When Amara took a meeting that mattered, the receptionist misdirected her to deliveries. When she received praise, it arrived on a short leash. At night, in her walk-up in Brooklyn, she kept a second desk, a scarred, thrifted table rescued from the curb and sanded to honesty. There, under a pharmacy lamp, she worked on pieces no one had asked for and which she could not make. Coats cut like cathedrals, skirts that moved as if listening to drums only they could hear. She pinned swatches to the wall the way some people pin travel maps. Under each swatch, she wrote a memory. Nana's orange head wrap at the airport, Auntie Sharon's velvet dress at a wedding where laughter outlasted the rain, the exact blue of a downtown Atlanta evening when traffic lights blinked like patient saints. On Fridays, she phoned home. Lenora's voice arrived like warm tea. "Eat well," her mother said. "Rest your eyes between stitches." "Tell me what you're making," Nana insisted, voice turning bright as brass. "A jacket that thinks it's a story," Amara would answer, and the women would hum their approval, the way women do when the world is trying to take something from their girl, and they mean to help her keep it. Sometimes on her lunch break, she slipped up to the atelier's roof, a rectangle of sky bordered by mechanical units, where she could look down at New York as if it were a complicated dress yet to be fitted. She kept a notebook in her coat. In it, she wrote the rules no one had taught her. Do not trade your color for admission. Do not sand your edges for a seat at their table. Build your own table. Let it be wide and ring with many spoons. The first time she saw Elliot Drake in the hallway, he was being followed by a wake of perfume and deference. He had the family face, camera kind, almost painfully arranged. He walked with the ease of someone for whom doors were rehearsed into always opening. He stopped at her table to ask about a sleeve cap, and when he listened, he really listened. She noticed that, how rare and devastating true attention can feel in a place that teaches you to fold yourself small. But this is not his chapter. This chapter belongs to the girl from Atlanta, who took the subway with pins still clinging to her hem, who learned to look at a room and see both the exits and the windows, who understood that absence can be as loud as applause. It belongs to the woman she was becoming in the shadows of a famous house, patient, exacting, unwilling to betray herself, even when the mirror of the industry reflected back a version of her that had been edited to decorum. In February, the snow turned the avenues into clean white bolts. The atelier hummed for Fashion Week, and Amara's hands moved with tireless knowledge. Yet in the small hours, after steam had softened wool and the last bodice was basted, she would hold a finished piece up to the light and ask it a private question. "Are you alive?" Sometimes the cloth answered yes. Often it said almost. The night before the big show, she stood alone at her Brooklyn window with a length of fabric looped over her arm. A black silk crepe shot through with bronze thread, a cloth that caught streetlight and made a small, stubborn galaxy. She could see, in the language of seams, a map away from smallness. Not an escape hatch, not a temper tantrum dressed as art. A map. She touched the fabric and thought of Nana's buttons, of Lenora's lavender, of Atlanta's porch light holding the evening open a little longer so the story could find its next sentence. Thus her origin was not a single moment, but a collection of deliberate ones, 1,000 patient adjustments, 100 private refusals, a handful of mercies extended to herself. If New York was a storm, she learned to walk upright beneath it. If the atelier was a temple, she learned which gods it served, and which she would not. And if the world insisted that beauty arrive in one accent only, she began composing harmonies the room could not yet hear. When she finally slept, the city lowered its volume, as if to let her dream in peace. Somewhere beyond the buildings, the river peeled moonlight into ribbon. Somewhere in a drawer, Nana's letter waited with its soft creased edges and impossible faith. Somewhere inside the girl from Atlanta, A design drew itself in the dark and woke her with its urgency. It was not yet a dress. It was a decision. It began quietly, the way many dangerous things do. Not with grand gestures, but with a small moment. A detail so subtle it could have been overlooked. A brushed shoulder in a narrow hallway. A question asked in earnest. A gaze that lingered a fraction too long. Amara had been working late at the Drake atelier that evening. The hum of the city outside reduced to a faint pulse beneath the atelier's tall windows. Her table lamp cast a gentle pool of amber over the muslin spread out before her. The building was nearly empty, just her, the faint rattle of pipes, and the ghost-like swish of fabric as she moved. When she heard his footsteps approach, she didn't turn. Everyone else had already gone home. Everyone except Elliot Drake. "Do you always work this late?" he asked, his voice warm, carrying the effortless charm of someone accustomed to being listened to. Amara looked up. There he was, immaculate as always. His tie loosened just enough to hint at rebellion, but never carelessness. His hair still in perfect place despite the hour. Elliot Drake had the kind of presence that made silence seem intentional, like the world paused for him to speak. "Sometimes," she replied softly, as though admitting to something secret. He stepped into the circle of light around her table, the faint scent of cedar and vetiver trailing after him. On the fabric before her was the black crepe she had been shaping for weeks, a dress with lines that belonged to no one but her. Elliot touched the edge with surprising gentleness, like a pianist grazing a familiar key. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "You work like the fabric belongs to you." "It does," Amara said, meeting his gaze, "until someone decides it doesn't." He tilted his head, studying her with a kind of curiosity that was both sharp and soft. "I like that answer." Their conversations grew from these brief encounters, fragments folded between deadlines and fittings, between his boardroom meetings and her pattern tables. He learned she loved late-night walks when the city lost its edge. She learned that he collected rare photography books and kept them in a private study, hidden from the curated perfection of his public life. He began bringing her small things, not extravagant, thoughtful. A single white rose left on her drafting table, a hand-pressed note quoting lines from Baldwin or Rilke, a leather-bound notebook when he caught her sketching on the backs of invoices. White roses, she thought, elegant, understated, but roses nonetheless. Beauty built on thorns. He invited her to a gallery opening in Soho one night, not the glitzy kind packed with photographers, but a dim, quiet exhibition of forgotten Black American artists, whose works, he said, reminded him of her designs. Sharp lines, quiet defiance. They walked through rooms washed in amber light, and the space seemed to shrink to just them. "You see stories in shapes," Elliot said as they paused in front of a stark, black and white portrait. "Most people only see beauty. You see meaning." Amara wanted to laugh at that, to tell him that meaning isn't a choice. It's the weight you carry when the world looks past you. But she didn't. Instead, she let the warmth of being seen soften the edges of the night. They began meeting in the city's quieter corners, a little jazz bar in the village where the saxophone curled around their conversations, a bookstore that smelled like paper and rain, the riverfront at midnight, where the skyline fractured into reflections. The romance unfolded the way silk slips from a hanger, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and then all at once, his hand on the small of her back as they left the gallery. Her laugh, unguarded, echoing in a hallway after midnight. The way his eyes found her in a crowded room, as though she was the only sentence he needed to read twice. But beneath every delicate moment, a faint pulse of unease beat like a second heart. He never introduced her to his family. When his friends saw them together, their smiles were polished but brittle. When she suggested they meet in places less hidden, a daytime cafe, a public dinner, he hesitated just long enough for her to feel the weight of that pause. He was always kind, always attentive, always just shy of public. Still, the soft intoxication of love is not easily resisted. Elliot's world was a place Amara had only ever walked through in borrowed time. Rooftop terraces strung with fairy lights, dinner tables where the silverware alone cost more than her rent, private art collections and winter estates where the snow stayed white. When he held her hand in these places, something inside her ached. Not because she wanted the wealth, but because she wanted to believe she belonged there with him. She remembered one night in late March. A storm had passed through Manhattan, leaving the air sharp and electric. Elliot took her to the rooftop of a hotel overlooking the Hudson. The city glittered below, a constellation of human ambition. He placed his coat over her shoulders, though she insisted she wasn't cold. "Do you ever feel," he said, looking out at the skyline, "like everything is waiting for you to claim it?" Amara tilted her head. "No," she answered softly. "I've learned to stop waiting for things to wait for me." He smiled then, the kind of smile that made people trust him, the kind that held both admiration and something quieter, something that could too easily turn to condescension if you weren't careful. When he kissed her for the first time, it was not a desperate kiss but a deliberate one, slow, certain, like he had already decided what she meant to him. She didn't know then that certainty can be its own kind of cage. In the weeks that followed, their lives entwined. He walked through her Brooklyn apartment, running fingers along the swatches pinned to her walls. "I love this," he'd say. "It feels alive here." He brought her vintage textiles from his travels, silk from Kyoto, antique lace from Bruges. She, in turn, brought him into the quiet honesty of her world. Dollar-sliced pizza after a long shift, laughter on subway platforms, mornings spent sketching in worn notebooks instead of in studios with marble floors. For a while, it was enough. But the world, as Amara would come to learn, had rules for people like Elliot Drake. Were not about who fits where, who is displayed, who is hidden. The first time she asked to meet his family, he kissed her forehead and said, "Soon." The second time, he changed the subject. The third time, he didn't answer at all. She told herself she understood, that his world was complicated, that love could be a quiet rebellion, that white roses, even with their thorns, could still bloom. But some part of her, the part that still remembered Nana's voice and Atlanta's porch light, began to keep count. Of silences, of pauses, of things unsaid. And in counting them, a truth began to hum softly beneath the music of their romance, waiting for its moment to rise. Love can be a place where two people meet, or it can be a place where one disappears. Amara had not yet decided which kind of place this was, but the air around her was beginning to change. The night before New York Fashion Week, the atelier glowed like a lantern, its tall windows spilling rectangles of light onto the slick February street. Inside, the air carried the quiet fever of perfection, steam lifting from pressed wool, chalk tracing soft constellations across black cloth, needles flashing like tiny meteors. Amara's hands moved with the muscle memory of devotion. Sleeves eased, hems whispered into obedience. A bodice that had resisted all evening finally yielded, and she laid it on the table with a small, private smile. In the glass beyond her reflection, city snow drifted, shy and relentless. Down the corridor, a door clicked. Voices threaded into the hush, low, familiar, meant for walls that had never learned to keep secrets. She wasn't listening until she was. Her name pulled her like a thread. "Amara," Elliot said, his voice the careful warmth he used for negotiations that needed to feel like intimacy. "She's brilliant," his father answered, silk over stone. "Brilliance is lovely, Elliot. So are fireworks. Neither lasts long enough to build a season." A gentle laugh. "Elliot's. You're not wrong. It's just, she sees things, and she makes me look progressive." Progressive. The word settled with the soft weight of dust. There was the clink of glass on glass. "Elliot," Mr. Drake continued, in the patient tone of money explaining the weather, "the board expects continuity. Elegance. Our clients don't want statements. They want certainty. Charlotte is certainty. She comes from the right people, knows the rooms, speaks the language without raising her voice." A pause stretched, delicate and deadly as a silk thread across a stair. Elliot exhaled. "Of course. I know. This." The next words came so easily she wondered if he had practiced them. "This is an arrangement. She understands." Arrangement. The syllables walked into Amara's chest and sat down. She didn't move. Her fingers curled against the table's edge until the wood stamped crescents into her palms. She saw, with startling clarity, the first white rose on her drafting table, the coat around her shoulders on the windy rooftop, The galleries, the notebooks, the river nights. She tried to place those moments beside the word that now divided them. Arrangement. The past slipped, like a bangle too large for the hand that wore it. "Good," his father said, with a satisfaction that did not require cruelty to be complete. "I worried you'd made it personal." Elliot's answer was a low, practiced hum. The conversation turned to seating charts, to donors' temperaments, to a European capsule they would announce when the snow melted. Amara stood in the pool of lamplight and watched her pulse tidy itself. When the morning came, the atelier widened into a bright, controlled storm. Rolling racks skimmed the floors. Models, sleek and temporary as swallows, moved between pins and mirrors. Assistants floated, headset cords glinting like lines on a score. The house playlist breathed confidence. It might have carried her, if not for the new quality in the air around her, a faint pressure drop that animals recognize before storms acquire thunder. Charlotte Avery arrived in a white cashmere coat that believed in itself. The room brightened for her the way rooms do when wealth enters, as if it were sunlight. She kissed cheeks, bestowed laughter, let her eyes linger on Amara with avid interest dressed as civility. "Darling," Charlotte said to no one and everyone, "isn't today delicious?" Then turning to Amara, "We've not been introduced properly, though I feel as if we have." A glance to Elliot, who had just stepped in behind her. "Your work is all over the boards." "All over," Elliot echoed, as if agreeing with a weather report. His gaze met Amara's, steady, sympathetic, empty of rescue. "Lovely muslin trials," Charlotte added, softly precise. Of course, the final line leans classic. "Our woman knows herself." Our woman. The phrase pried a seam open. It did not include Amara's grandmother's. It did not include the swatches on her Brooklyn wall. "Amara," Elliot said, her name delivered with managerial calm. "Can we speak?" He led her to an empty fitting room, the mirror catching them and multiplying them into a small, bright gallery. The door closed with a hush that sounded like a verdict. He did not sit. He began with kindness, which is to say, he began with anesthesia. "You know how much I value you." In the mirror behind him, she was very still, a figure carved from dusk. "Do I?" His throat shifted. "I need to protect the house, the brand. There are optics, expectations. You know what the board is like. My father," he lifted a hand, as if he could adjust the air. "We've had something rare. But it can't be permanent. Not publicly, not now." She thought of the roof, the river, the promise in his deliberate kiss. She thought of how men like him weaponize the word "we." "You told your father it was an arrangement." Her voice surprised her. It sounded like an instrument refusing to go out of tune. A flicker crossed his face, gone as soon as light leaves a wave. "I said what I had to say. You're pragmatic, Amara. That's one of the things He didn't choose a verb. "This doesn't diminish you. It edits me," she said, "and you call it continuity." Outside, the house beat onward. Zippers, heels, laughter tuned to please. Inside, he slipped the final sentence into place with the elegance of a last button. "It's best if you don't work the show today." Silence rose between them, generous and unoccupied. She nodded once. The mirror held her upright while gravity tested her. Word travels in ateliers like electricity. By the time she returned to the main room, conversations were already oiled to slide around her. Some faces arranged themselves into sympathy. Others brightened with interest the way faces do near windows. Charlotte, stationed near the primary mirror as if it were a throne, watched Amara calmly pack her kit. "It's wise, I think," Charlotte offered lightly, "to separate feelings and work. The brand suffers otherwise." She smiled with flawless decorum. "You'll land on your feet. Girls like you always do. Girls like you." The old phrase stepped out of its costume. Two security men appeared with the apologetic dignity of professionals asked to move rain. They were gentle in the way that makes a person invisible, standing just close enough to shape the path. Phones tipped, as if gravity had adjusted itself around the moment. Somewhere, someone started a live stream. The image would be brief, artful, narratively convenient. A black woman led from a white room where beauty tried to be uncomplicated. As she crossed the floor, The weight she had carried since last night shifted, resolving from ache into articulation. She saw the boards she had built, stripped of fire. She saw the drafts she had drawn, praised and pared down to neutrality. She saw the word progressive, used like a lapel pin. She saw the word arrangement, used like a lock. At the threshold, she paused, not to invite pity or to search Elliot's face, which she did not. She paused to set something down on the marble that was not hers to carry anymore. When she stepped out into the winter glare, the cold struck clean, and the city answered with 1,000 indifferent lights. Indifference, she discovered, could be a mercy. It leaves you alone long enough to hear yourself. On the sidewalk, snow surrendered under tires in soft, repetitive sighs. Her phone shook with messages, some kind, some carnivorous. The live stream cut into her awareness in fragments. Did you see? They finally, she thought. The narrative wrote itself quickly, as narratives do when the cast is familiar. She walked without hurrying, the city's noise settling around her like a heavy coat. At the first intersection, she looked up and caught her reflection in a shop window. Eyes steady, mouth undecorated by apology. The image did not look diminished. It looked distilled. Back home, her apartment felt like the inside of a shell, curved, quiet, remembering oceans. She stood before the wall of pinned swatches and read their colors like a litany until her breathing matched them. On the chair lay the black crepe shot through with bronze, the cloth that had answered almost when she'd asked it whether it was alive. She touched it now and understood what had been missing. Not thread, not time. Permission. Her phone flashed once more. Charlotte's engagement appeared in a photograph engineered to be inevitable. White coat against white snow, ring tilted to catch winter light. Elliot smiling with an ease he wore like cologne. The caption used the words timeless and legacy. The comments performed their choreography. Somewhere inside the applause, a sentence finished writing itself in Amara's bones. The heart breaks loudly. The future chooses a quieter register. It speaks in designs, in rules you write for yourself, in doors you build when architecture refuses you. She sat at her desk, drew the lamp closer, and set the crepe beneath her hands. Outside, sirens braided themselves with ordinary traffic. Inside, she inhaled, threaded the needle, and began the first stitch that would not ask to be invited anywhere. The city did not break stride for her sorrow. It never does. New York kept its appointments with itself. Subways shouldering dawn, steam rising from winter grates, bakeries opening like small, warm doors against the cold, while Amara learned the choreography of erasure. The morning after the show that never was, she woke to a phone that pulsed like a wounded thing. Notifications spilled and multiplied. There she was, a moving figure at the edge of a frame, escorted toward an exit, as if the building were gently returning something to the street that had never belonged inside. The headlines were careful, elegant, and sharp the way a paper cut is sharp. A promising talent and the pitfalls of office romance. Tradition versus disruption at a legacy house. The thin line between muse and misstep. No one used the words they meant. They didn't need to. The language of exclusion is fluent in inference. Requests for meetings evaporated so cleanly she could almost admire the craft of it. Emails that had once arrived punctually, with exclamation points, with "can't wait to see more," fell silent. A week passed, then two. She sent follow-ups that felt like bottles cast into a cold ocean. Somewhere, waves tore the paper into pale strings. When invitations came, they came dimmed. A coffee chat at an agency whose website boasted diversity and thumbnail tokens. A portfolio review with a mid-level editor who proposed she try menswear. It's less emotional, you know, and followed the suggestion with a bright professional smile that asked to be believed. In one meeting, a woman glanced at Amara's board of patterns and said kindly that they sang loudly. In another, a man praised her impeccable diction before explaining that their brand narrative aligned more closely with paler stories. She left with a brochure pressed into her palm like a sympathy card. Rent arrived precisely when it always did, a small fact wearing a large crown. She tightened everything: groceries, heat, the length of showers. She sold 3 pairs of shoes she had once considered essential to an idea of herself she no longer needed. At night, she saved thread ends in a glass jar and watched them climb toward the rim. The worst moments were never the loud ones. They were the elegantly staged indifferences. The day she entered a lobby for an interview and a guard directed her wordlessly toward the service elevator. The afternoon, a receptionist looked past her twice, then handed her a vendor badge with the wrong name. The murmured, "We'll be in touch," that spoke with such certainty it paradoxically proved itself a lie. She had not known that silence could develop muscle, that it could lift whole possibilities and remove them from a room without anyone seeing the doors move. On a gray Tuesday that smelled faintly of snow, she ducked into a cafe in Flatiron to wait out an appointment that would later be canceled by a message sent without apology. The room was all white tiles and Edison bulbs, and the tables were crowded with people carrying laptops like shields. She ordered tea and stood near a display of lemon tarts, reading the names written in good handwriting beneath each cake, as if names could sweeten anything. At the corner table, 3 assistant editors from a glossy magazine were discussing the season. She didn't mean to listen, but there it was, her name, spoken with the weightless authority of someone setting down a cup. "Sent her deck to creative," one said, wrapping a scarf twice around her neck though she was indoors. "They feel she may not understand our woman." "Our woman," another echoed, satisfied. "Anyway, we've already got a voice in that space." "Inclusion fatigue," the third offered, and they laughed, low, confidential, the kind of laughter that believes itself harmless. Amara felt a heat rise that was not humiliation, but recognition, old and ancestral. She forgot her tea and walked out into the winter, the air slicing clean stripes in her lungs. On the sidewalk she stopped, the city flowing past her like a river choosing to go around a rock. And for the first time since the atelier, she allowed herself to say the blunt word inside the elegant ones. Not progress, not optics. The blunt word, the honest one. She went home early. The apartment had taken on a new geometry, as if the walls had inched inward while she was out, eager to offer intimacy that felt like containment. She turned on no lights. In the dusk, the pin swatches on the wall glowed like small stained glass windows. She stood before them and grieved, not for Elliot or for a job, but for the hours she had spent trying to convince a room to want what it had already decided to refuse. When the phone rang, she was grateful for the interruption until she saw the caller ID, Lenora. She had put off this conversation, not out of fear of judgment, but because a mother's tenderness can be a mirror, and she was not ready to look. "Baby," her mother said when she picked up, the word a hallway back to childhood. "I saw something on the internet I didn't like." Amara closed her eyes. "It looks worse than it was." "That is the problem with looks," Lenora said softly. "They go around acting like facts." They spoke for a long time, about bills, about Nana's knees, about whether the snow in Atlanta this year had the decency to melt by noon. When silence came, it did not accuse. "I can come home," her mother offered, lightly, as if suggesting soup. "We can start again from our porch. The world is not only one city wide." "I know," Amara said, tracing a seam on the tabletop with her fingertip. "I'm just trying to hear what the next right sound is." After they hung up, the quiet deepened into something almost medicinal. She studied her desk the way a doctor examines an instrument tray, each tool familiar, each thread a possibility. She realized she had been living on a diet of maybes. Maybe this meeting, maybe that editor, maybe if she softens, if she trims, if she says it a shade paler. Maybes are nourishing until they are not. Then they turn to chalk. The days stretched. She took small jobs that did not bear her name. She hemmed for an off-Broadway costume shop and stitched pockets into jackets that had been designed without them. She advised a startup brand run by 2 earnest sisters who couldn't pay her yet, but meant it when they promised they would. She taught a Saturday workshop at a community center on the edge of Bed-Stuy, and 10 girls with braids and bright eyes learned how to make a French seam that would not betray them. Those afternoons steadied her more than she admitted. And still the city refused to call her by the name she had brought to it. She was tired of persuading. She wanted to build. On a night when the river wore a band of pewter and the moon forgot itself behind high clouds, she spread the black crepe and bronze thread across her table and did nothing. She let the fabric be fabric. She sat with the knot-making until her shoulders lowered. Then, without deciding to, she began to draw. The lines came like a confession she had been withholding from herself. Severe where she had learned severity, generous where she refused to be edited, a bodice that understood architecture and a skirt that remembered drums. She worked until the first subways shook the neighborhood awake. The piece was not finished, but it was alive in a way that frightened and fed her. She washed her hands. The water ran gray with chalk and metallic with the ghost of bronze. In the mirror, her face looked both older and more exact. The next morning, the city resumed its unhurried indifference. She put on a coat that knew how to argue with wind and stepped outside. On the stoop sat a small package with no return address. Inside, a photograph, printed on thick paper, of her walking out of the atelier into the snow. Someone had caught her at the moment between inside and out, door and street, past and what comes after. The framing was kind. She looked solitary but not alone. Amara slid the photograph into the corner of her mirror. She did not know who sent it. She did not need to. The image reminded her of a truth that predates every house and runway. There is a difference between being seen and being watched. She dressed her bed with the muslin for a new pattern and ate breakfast standing up, an orange peeled with careful fingers, the bright skins piling like little flames. When she left for the day's work, the small jobs, the paying ones, the honest ones, she locked the door behind her and felt something in her chest click from ache to angle. Rock bottom had not been a single fall. It had been a series of polite descents into rooms where she gradually misplaced her outline. But in that basement of days, she found a leaner vocabulary. She learned to name the weather without blaming the sky. She learned that invisibility is not erasure. It is a shadow that proves a body blocks the light. By night, the city wrote its name in neon on the low clouds. Amara stitched. By morning, a plan, still small, still shy of detail, stood up in her like a spine. It did not announce itself with trumpets. It whispered, sensible and severe. Stop asking for doors. Start building walls that can hold windows. Spring arrived by degrees, like someone opening a door in cautious inches. Brooklyn thawed first in the tree pits, where stubborn shoots threaded up through cold soil. In the mornings, delivery trucks coughed awake beneath Amara's window. At night, the bodega cat resumed its watch on the milk crate throne. Inside her walk-up, she cleared the living room the way ships clear decks for weather. The thrifted sofa slid to a corner. The rug rolled tight as a scroll. On the longest wall, she built a constellation: pins, swatches, photographs, sketches, until the plaster looked lit from within. If failure had been a room where other people decided the furniture, this would be a room that obeyed only her hands. She called it, privately, the war room, not for battle against a person, but against the quiet temptation to make herself smaller. The strategy was ritual: morning tea, a hymn of lists, and then the work. Patterns were drafted with severe kindness. Fabrics were chosen like truths. No lies that looked expensive, only cloth that kept its promises. She taught 2 nights a week at the community center, and after class let the girls crowd close to her table to see a sleeve bloom out of flatness. A seam is a secret, she'd say, tapping the line. Hide nothing you'll be asked to live with. Money remained an unglamorous metronome. She hemmed, altered, advised. She learned to thread scarcity through a needle and pull it into something sturdy. When she had nothing else to offer, she offered time. To a young photographer named B, whose eyes searched for tenderness in concrete. To a makeup artist, Kaito, who painted faces like he was restoring frescoes. To a pattern assistant, Luz, whose jokes landed like small sparrows in the room, startling and welcome. They were not a company yet. They were a chorus that found the same key without agreeing to. The aesthetic that had been scolded in conference rooms grew lean and fluent here. West African geometry met New York's stripped-down discipline. Volume negotiated with gravity. Bronze thread appeared not as flourish, but as punctuation. She wrote rules on brown paper and taped them high. Color is intention, not decoration. Comfort is not the enemy of elegance. The body does not apologize. The garment listens. On Sundays, she ironed to old records while calling home. Lenora, who measured wellness by the sound of her daughter's laugh, kept the conversation wide. Pies, neighborhood gossip, a nurse on her floor who dressed like royalty on payday. Nana asked for pictures of every sleeve. You must sign your work where only you can find it, Nana advised. It is good for the soul to know where it is hiding. The first call that sounded like a door came from a fledgling label showing during an indie fashion week on the Lower East Side. The designer, Mira Yuan, made pieces that looked like blueprints learning to sing. Our stylist fell through, Mira confessed, contrition fastened to every word. I've admired your eye. It's not big money. The number she named was almost tender in its smallness. Amara said yes. Hunger makes a person brave. Clarity keeps them gentle. The venue was a repurposed warehouse with brick walls that remembered everything. 15 looks hung on a single rack like notes in search of their song. Backstage was devoted chaos. Models delayed by train trouble, a lighting tech with a migraine, a run sheet that forgot the laws of feet. The lead stylist had indeed fallen through. The assistant clutched a clipboard as if it were a life raft. Mira's hands trembled with the kind of love that looks like fear. Amara stood dead center in the noise and let it pass through. The pieces were good, hard-edged coats softening at the seams, skirts that turned corners like city blocks. But the order was wrong. The story was upside down. She pulled the rack forward as if it were an instrument and began to tune. First, she told the team, we breathe. Breathing altered the room, thick air thinning into something usable. We cast by energy, not height. She swapped shoes that lied about posture for shoes that taught it. She moved a narrow silk dress from look 12 to look 1 because it walked like an opening sentence. Kaito's hands flickered through palettes as she called tones. Brick, river, smoke. Words that found exact shades without arguing over their names. Luz rewrote the run sheet, her pencil racing. B, who had come to shoot backstage, climbed a ladder for a single still. Mira looking at Amara with the expression of someone watching a locked door swing. Where's your city? Amara asked the collection. Where's the part that remembers hands? She added a belt cut from surplus leather. She removed a needless ruffle like a lie peeled away without blood. She changed the way 3 models would carry their shoulders, and the garments obeyed. When the show began, it moved like a train that knew all its stops. The narrow silk dress entered with a hush and a certainty. Coats with architectural bravado followed, softened by the memory of touch. Metallic thread caught the light once, then learned discretion. By look 9, you could hear it, the collective inhale of a room encountering coherence. The final exit was not a triumph, but a completion, which is rarer and worth more. After the applause, the designer cried the way buildings release heat, quietly, steadily, back into the night. B's images migrated online before the team had finished breaking down the rack, a sequence that revealed the collection's reordered logic. A shot of Amara crouched at a hem, her face lit with work rather than performance, and a single photograph that traveled fast. Mira and Amara holding opposite ends of a coat between them like a flag they'd both decided to carry. The internet did what it does, but for once it did it with grace. Words found her name without chewing it. Who is Amara Collins? The show-steadying hand behind Mira Yuan. A new language of form that feels like home and forward at once. Inboxes that had gone quiet remembered speech. The subject lines wore real verbs. Work arrived, still small, still precarious, but threaded with respect. A magazine that had once suggested she try menswear now asked for a story on silhouette and power. No caveats attached. A boutique in Crown Heights commissioned 10 pieces on consignment with a contract that read like the opposite of a trap. She rented a shared studio with light that behaved and a landlord who answered texts. The war room moved there without quite leaving home. The wall reconstructed itself, swatches, maps, a string tying images like constellations. With momentum came the old shadow, a hand from nowhere attempting to adjust her outline. The palette, one client hinted, smiling, could whisper a bit more. Another proposed adding a heritage capsule, meaning something bright and easily consumed. She smiled with her eyes and refused with her seams. Pieces left her table wearing the dignity of the bodies that would enter them. She learned to hire her own nose, B shot the lookbooks. Kaito keyed the shows. Luz kept the calendar from wandering. On Thursday nights, the team ate noodles from paper cartons on the floor and argued about sleeve caps as if debating philosophy. Sometimes the girls from the community center stopped by, and the room brightened simply because it contained their future. One evening, after a day that had begun in train delays and ended in quiet victories, Amara rode the G back to her stop and walked the long block home beneath sycamores that were trying on leaves. She thought of the first time she had heard herself say the word arrangement and felt it fall like a sentence with no appeal. She thought of the photograph of her crossing the threshold into snow. It was still pinned at the mirror, but it had changed meanings. It no longer depicted exile. It recorded departure. On her desk, a note from Mira awaited. A single line in careful handwriting. "You made my work into itself." Amara read it twice, then set it beneath Nana's latest letter. Outside, somewhere between buildings, a siren became a lullaby by distance. Inside, the war room breathed like a living thing. Rebirth, she discovered, wasn't the phoenix spectacle of all flame and instant flight. It was the quieter miracle of good lungs. Inhale measure, exhale meaning, until the air belonged to you again. In the morning, she would take the train to the studio, tape new rules higher on the wall, and begin again at the table, where cloth remembers who it's for. The plan that had stood up in her like a spine now learned to walk. Summer arrived the way applause does, gradually, then suddenly. In the shared studio, light pooled on the concrete like silk poured from a high shelf. The wall of swatches had outgrown itself, expanding into a map of intentions. Threads of bronze traced pathways between images the way rivers find oceans. Somewhere between the Thursday noodles and the late-night hymns, the chorus around Amara learned its harmonies by heart. They stopped asking if they were a company and began behaving like one. The first editorial came because B's photographs moved through the city like rumor. A mid-tier magazine gave them 6 pages, hard-won, poorly paid, and perfect. Amara refused a white box set. She staged the shoot in a brownstone parlor, lined with vinyl records, and a velvet sofa that remembered every conversation. Models of every shade and geometry leaned against archways, sat on armrests, claimed air. The clothes held them without correcting them. The spread read like a family album that had never before been permitted into print. The magazine called it New Classicism. B called it Tuesday. Amara called it Work Done Right. Commissions multiplied in the slow arithmetic of trust. A dancer at the Joyce wanted a dress that could bow without apology. A chef opening a small restaurant in Prospect Lefferts asked for jackets that understood heat and swagger. A violinist needed a coat that could enter silence like a sentence. Each request arrived with a story, and the garments answered in the same language. She learned that the most extravagant luxury is intention that fits. By winter, the studio had a name that felt like an oath. Collins Studio. Luz painted it in spare black letters on the glass door and stood back as if she had just released a kite. The first collection under that name did not walk down a runway so much as walk into a room where it had long been expected. Kaito's palette was winter fruit and cathedral smoke. Bia's lens found laughter and restraint. It was a quiet show in a borrowed chapel with folding chairs and a floor that creaked, but the front row filled itself with people who had learned to listen for rumors of beauty. Afterward, a critic whose sentences could wound or warm wrote, "The clothes don't try to be loud. They insist on being heard." With attention came negotiations, and with negotiations came the temptation to forget the first rules pinned high. Buyers asked for one pop piece that could work as a window display, meaning something that shouted. Agents recommended a celebrity collaboration that made Amara feel like a mannequin she wouldn't hire. She declined with a grace that did not wobble. The studio had learned to eat from small plates. It would not starve in exchange for spectacle. Casting became a manifesto. Boys with shy shoulders, women with bellies that proved their love of life, elders whose hands told intricate histories. Collins' studio held them all without apology. The fittings were orchestras of permission. "We cut to meet you," Amara would say, chalking a shoulder with a tenderness that paradoxically made people stand taller. The teams adopted her verbs: meet, honor, carry, listen. A garment could do all four. The internet, which had once swallowed her name, began to offer it back intact. Videos of the studio at work landed softly in timelines. Luz drafting like a cartographer. Bia directing with eyes and a raised eyebrow. Kaito dusting skin until a face remembered itself. Comments didn't argue about categories. They said things like, "This looks like my aunt and I feel steadier just watching." The war room had become a beacon by simply refusing to lie. In spring, a museum asked Collins Studio to design uniforms for the docents of a new gallery wing devoted to the Black American Archive. Amara said yes before the sentence finished. She made waistcoats with pockets that respected the weight of keys and small notebooks, skirts that moved without insisting, trousers whose waistband understood long days. On opening night, she watched the docents shepherd families past portraits that would not let themselves be forgotten. And for the first time since the snow outside the atelier, tears came without shame. She had dressed the caretakers of memory. Opportunities sharpened like knives laid in order. A heritage house hinted at a partnership. A luxury retailer offered a pop-up on a corner that printed money for anything it kissed. Amara asked for time to think, then laid the offers on the studio table between noodles and minutes. They accepted the pop-up and declined the house. "We can't be somebody's wild wing," she said. "Our architecture is our own." No one argued. The room had learned her grammar. Vogue called, not a pity profile, a feature with words that did not lean on trend. They sent a writer who arrived with a recorder and a notebook, and left the recorder in a bag and the notebook on the table. They asked about Nana's buttons, about the porch in Atlanta, about the first jacket that had tried to think it was a story. The piece ran with photographs of hands and chalk dust, of a sleeve that could make a person breathe easier. The headline was simple enough to trust: "The architect of tender structure." Orders followed, and with them, a larger studio on a block that drank afternoon light. The wall was rebuilt taller. The rules were repinned higher. New staff arrived and learned to speak the house verbs before they learned where the scissors lived. The chorus thickened into a small orchestra, and the work's timbre deepened. Then, one Tuesday that had done nothing to predict itself, an email slipped into the quiet part of the afternoon. From Comité du Gala International, Paris. Subject: Invitation. Creative direction, proposal. The message was clean, almost austere. Paris requested that Amara Collins serve as creative director for the International Fashion Gala, the same stage that had once posed as evidence she would never be welcomed. The letter praised her global eye, her refusal to condescend to beauty, her structural grace. It offered travel, budget, authority, and most surprisingly, final approval on casting and seating. The room went religiously silent as she read it aloud. Someone's chopsticks stilled in midair. B whispered an oath that sounded like gratitude in a foreign tongue. Luz sat down and laughed until her eyes shone. Kaito pressed a hand to his chest, as if confirming the heart was still in its appointed place. Amara did not answer the email that day. She took the long walk home by streets that had watched her carry coffee and sorrow in bolts of cloth. At the river, ferries stitched light into water. Across the dark, Manhattan glowed with its incurable need to prove itself. She leaned on the railing and tried the words on the air. Paris. Creative director. They didn't tilt. They stood. Back home, she lit a single lamp and opened the drawer where Nana's letters lived among fortune scraps, ticket stubs, a ribbon from the first sample she ever cut under her own name, the photograph of the threshold into snow. She held the picture and felt its temperature change. Once, it had documented humiliation. Then, departure. Now, it felt like a passport stamp, evidence of a border crossed and a country built. She wrote her reply in the grammar the studio had learned. Measured, exact, not submissive. Thank you for the invitation. If we are to honor the future you have described, I will require full creative control, inclusive casting at scale, a budget for artisans whose work is often cited but rarely credited, and authority over the story told by the room, from runway to seat map. If those terms are agreeable, I am yours. Paris agreed, Swiftly, politely, entirely. The next morning, the war room put on its traveling clothes. Flights were booked, schedules drawn, lists made in a hand that did not shake. The wall received a new map, arrows from Brooklyn to the right bank, from Atlanta to the Seine. The team stood before it as if at a window, each seeing a version of the same city. "The world is looking," B murmured. "The world is capable of learning," Amara answered. And with that, the chorus retuned itself for a larger hall. The rise had not been a cliff scaled in spectacle, but a staircase built at night, one measured step at a time. Now, at the landing, a door waited that once would not open. The handle was warm, the hinge unresistant. The room beyond, light. Paris opened its palms and offered light. Morning burned through the mist along the Seine. Barges moved like measured thoughts beneath the bridges. Inside the Louvre's glass atrium, scaffolds surrendered, cables vanished into order, and Amara's blueprint unfolded into a world that obeyed its own gravity. She had rewritten the Gala into a living text, every surface, every chair, every breath a line that knew its place in the sentence. The runway did not cut the room like a blade. It braided the space, curving past the fountain and returning to itself with the assurance of a river. At its edges rose altars to labor, loom fragments, hand-carved frames, dye vessels on plinths, tools named and credited, their makers recorded in gilt script. Above, a canopy of translucent panels drifted like slow clouds. When the house lights dimmed, they held images of hands. Old hands, young hands, working, beating, quilting, pressing, blessing. The music began as a distant heartbeat and returned as an orchestra of breath and strings. Amara moved through the final checks the way a conductor walks his stage before the overture. Kaito's palette kissed cheekbones into sculpture. B tested exposures against bronze thread and found the exact moment light became narrative. Luz, with her clipboard dignified as scripture, revised the seat map for the last time and set it on the lectern. At table 1, the placards waited, names like riverstones, heavy and exact. Among them, Elliot Drake and Charlotte Avery. They arrived together in a careful vignette, the tuxedo's lapel narrow as a promise, the gown white enough to pretend at virtue. The clique of photographers died as the house lights lowered. Elliot looked toward the runway, then toward the mezzanine, searching an altitude where Amara might hover. He found her instead at the floor's crown, a dark figure in an atelier black column, with a single line of bronze stitched down the spine like a quiet lightning strike. She did not look away. She did not look through. She looked as a sovereign does, acknowledgement without debt. The opening model stepped into the circuit, and the room altered its breathing. Not a parade of sameness, but a procession of bodies that carried time inside them. Silver hair plaited like memory, shoulders that had learned storms, bellies soft with histories, limbs that spoke many alphabets of grace. The first look, sleek silk cut to move like a whispered imperative, set the grammar. Then coats whose architecture bent enough to hold tenderness, skirts that remembered drums at the hem and cathedrals at the waist. Bronze thread glinted once, then subsided, punctuation rather than spectacle. The narration threaded itself between exits. In the second movement, a musician wove cora and cello into a dialogue, and the canopy bloomed with names. Textile co-ops in Ghana and G's Bend, ateliers in Abusan and Kyoto, beadworkers from Johannesburg, embroiderers from Oaxaca. Each name was spoken aloud in a voice that did not hurry. People in the audience turned to each other, surprised by the ease with which reverence can be modern. Amara's speech met the room at the third movement, brief as a glass raised among intimates. "We inherit methods," she said, the microphone soft beneath her fingers. "We inherit injuries. Tonight, we honor hands that taught the world to dress itself. May beauty never be a translation that forgets its origin." She said nothing about redemption. She had no need to repeat what the cloth already articulated. At table 1, Charlotte's smile concentrated like perfume. Elliot's hands obeyed his glass. His eyes disobeyed and returned to the runway, where the final sequence assembled its quiet crescendo. A dress appeared that held three geographies at once. A bodice cut to the French bone. A skirt whose panels sang in kente geometry, subdued to urban black. A train pieced with Russian amber tones braided through a field of midnight. It did not shout. It consolidated, the way a horizon gathers all its lights and makes them one. The auction began with a curator's voice chiseled smooth by years of good hauls. Paintings and sculptures left the stage in civilized sums. Then the final lot rose, rotating beneath the canopy. The convergent gown, sewn in triple witness. Artisans from 3 continents named on a small bronze plaque at the hem. The room leaned forward in one movement, oriented by appetite. Bidding opened at €50,000 and behaved as opening bids do. Polite, eager to prove fluency. 100, 150, 200 from a house that liked its philanthropy documented. The dress revolved, indifferent to money. At 250, a murmur. At 300, a hand rose at table 1, pale against the dark. Elliot Drake. Every head turned because some narratives are too available to resist. His voice did not carry. His name did. He sat straighter, blue eyes attempting sincerity like a borrowed garment. A journalist's pen hesitated mid-sentence. A camera remembered him well. 300,000, the auctioneer repeated, pleased with the shape of the number in the air. Do I hear 350? A pause opened, warm-blooded. Somewhere in the balcony, a bracelet slid on a wrist. Somewhere on the floor, a chair creaked with a small history. The dress turned once more beneath the names of its makers. From the rear aisle, a voice answered with the clarity of a bell struck clean. 500,000. Amara did not raise her hand. She had sent an associate to the numbered aisle during rehearsal, not for concealment, but for symmetry. The figure stood, unadorned, and let the number land. It did not jostle. It did not swagger. It occupied. The auctioneer blinked, recalibrated, delighted. 500,000. Do I hear? No. Elliot's word was soft and audible. It sounded like a door finding its frame. He sat back, and for the first time that evening, his face learned a color unbecoming to cameras. Sold, the gavel sang, and the room exhaled a chord that carried awe, and something granular, relief perhaps, that beauty had chosen its custodian with intention rather than myth. Applause rose, not frantic. A standing understood rather than instructed. The canopy dimmed from hands to dusk. The runway's final loop closed. The orchestra laid its instruments down like tools that had earned their rest. People approached Amara the way one approaches a relic newly revealed, reverent, greedy for proximity, careful not to appear so. Designers with long pedigrees pressed cards that behaved like petitions. Editors whose pens had once refused her now wrote her name with deliberate consonants. She accepted with the economy of someone who remembers the price of thread. When the crowd thinned and the last journalist lowered her recorder, Elliot rose from table 1. Charlotte had already drifted toward a cluster of lenses. Radiance seeks its own reflections. He crossed the floor with the step of a man who knows that floors can open or close beneath him, depending on the day. He stopped at the respectful distance the room demanded, and folded his hands as if the posture could excuse the history behind it. Amara, he said. The name came out correctly, without rehearsal. She turned to face him, daylight in night's clothing. Up close she could see how carefully he had arranged his regret, how sincerely he had ironed it. It did not move her. That was extraordinary, he offered. It was necessary, she answered. He glanced toward the dress's vacant pedestal, then back to her. I wanted. He let the sentence break its heel and start again. I am sorry. For what I said then. For what I was then. Language matters, she said, but so do rooms. You chose yours. No anger, no flair. Only a ledger balanced to the scent. I've changed, he tried. Too gently for courtroom, too late for theater. So have I. Amara extended a hand, the neutral instrument of commerce and civility. He took it. The handshake lasted exactly as long as courtesy requires, and not a heartbeat more. She released him first. In a city that sells miracles by the dozen, this was what transformation looks like. Not a kiss, not a scene, not a reprise. An audit quietly completed. She stepped past him, not around, the way a river revises a shore. Staff began dismantling the altars to labor, wrapping tools in soft paper as if putting bones to bed. The canopy lifted toward the ceiling and became architecture again. Outside, Paris had decided on stars. Within the glass, the last guests slipped along the braid of runway and out into night, carrying with them the sensation of having watched the future decline to apologize. In a quiet corner, Luz closed her clipboard. Bia capped a lens. Kaito stacked compacts like little moons. Their faces reflected the glow of work well spent. Amara joined them, and for a moment the four stood in a small ring of ordinary time amid the grandeur. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Some victories prefer silence. Sound would only cheapen their geometry. Later, in the service corridor, where even cathedrals keep their brooms, a crate waited with the dress carefully suspended within. The bronze plaque at its hem had been polished by someone who understood that names deserve to shine. The courier checked the manifest. Destination, Collins Studio, Brooklyn. Custodian, Collins Foundation. For traveling exhibition. A long game, then. Not possession, but circulation. Amara signed. The pen felt cool. She handed it back and stepped out beneath the pyramid's dark geometry, where wind braided the scents of stone and river and late roses from someone's lapel. Paris, which had known queens and revolutions, held her with an old city's tolerant gaze. She lifted her chin, not as a signal to photographers, but as a way to keep the crown light. The night did not congratulate her. It accompanied her, which is better. The car door opened. She entered. Behind her, the Louvre folded its glass like a closing eye over a memory it intended to keep. Ahead, the road laid itself straight to the river and over it, toward a morning already warming in another borough, toward a studio whose wall waited for a new map, and a team who understood that thrones are only chairs until work sits in them. Brooklyn greeted her as it always did, without ceremony, without pretense, just the soft rhythm of her block, the groan of the bakery's awning as it rolled open, the clatter of crates on pavement, a pigeon's indifferent flight. But beneath that ordinary quiet, something had changed. Not in the city, but in her. Paris had not followed her home in the form of applause. It followed in silence, in the way a river carries the shape of its last bend even after it turns. Amara unlocked the studio, stepped inside, and breathed in the familiar scent of starch, wood, chalk, and ambition. A streak of sunlight broke across the wall where swatches formed a private constellation, as if the morning had been waiting to be allowed in. Luz arrived first, wrapped in a scarf that still held Parisian night air. B followed, carrying her camera like a heartbeat. Kaito came last, shoulders still humming from the orchestral buzz of backstage adrenaline. They didn't speak right away. Instead, they stood there, letting the studio remember them, and letting themselves remember the studio. The world had widened, but this room was still its nucleus. On the table lay the crate, its seal unbroken, containing the dress that had silenced a hall built to worship other people's stories. Bronze plaque at the hem, soft fabric folded like a promise. Luz traced the box's edge with the tip of one finger, reverent and amused all at once. "We brought her home," she whispered. Home, a word that, for so long, had been elusive. For Amara, home had once meant porch lights in Atlanta and her grandmother's sewing basket. Then it had meant nothing at all, just echoes in a city that refused to say her name. And now it meant something else entirely, a space of her own making, carved from labor, loss, and stubborn beauty. The Gala had rewritten what the world expected of her, but it hadn't changed her, not really. She was still the girl who stitched in silence, who believed cloth could speak, who had once walked away from a building where someone else had decided her worth. What changed was that now, the world had learned to listen to the language she had been speaking all along. Amara opened the crate. The gown unfurled slowly, as if it too had learned the art of making an entrance. It shimmered, not with spectacle, but with memory. The room seemed to tilt forward with it, bronze thread whispering its story, silk remembering the stage beneath the Louvre's glass canopy, stitches still humming with the pulse of 100 held breaths. He lifted her camera and began to shoot, not for a magazine, not for press, but for themselves. The flash of the lens caught Amara's reflection in the gown's sheen, steady, still, unadorned. Not the queen of anyone's empire, but the architect of her own. She thought of Elliot for the briefest flicker, not as a wound, but as a landmark she had long since passed. She remembered the humiliation, the narrowness of someone else's vision, and how it had forged a fire in her bones that never needed his apology. She remembered that night in the snow, walking into the city's cold with nothing but the pulse of her own name. That girl was not gone. She stood here in this studio unbroken, multiplied. The rise to power is often painted as a single moment, a door swinging open, a crown descending. But Amara knew better. Triumph had been less like fireworks and more like the steady, patient stitching of a seam no one believed in but her. It had been late nights, quiet refusals, the building of a vocabulary that did not require permission. She had become a constellation visible even to those who had once refused to look up. As the dress caught the light, she turned to her team. "We're not done," she said softly. Bea lowered her camera, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "We never are." Paris had been a performance of power. Brooklyn was the work. And the work, steady, stubborn, alive, was what mattered most. From here there would be new collections, new battles, new small victories that would never make headlines, but would change lives anyway. A dress for a bride who wanted to feel like herself, not a silhouette. A coat for a musician who needed to move like wind. A runway in a small town where a girl would watch and whisper, "I could do that too." This was the quiet glory of transcendence, not revenge, not spectacle. A life built on her own terms with both hands on the needle. Amara walked to the wall, where the original war room sketch still hung, creased, marked, weathered by time. She added a new line to it, sweeping and bold. "Legacy is not inherited, it is made." She pinned the sentence with bronze thread, stepped back, and let the sun wash over it. The team dispersed into their usual rhythm, Luz arranging fabrics, Kaito testing palettes, Bea crouching low for the perfect angle. The world outside might have been watching, but in here, time moved to the pulse of work. Real work, the kind that doesn't glitter but glows. Amara stood at her table once more. The sound of scissors, slicing into new cloth, filled the room like a quiet anthem. This was not the end of her story. It was its wide, radiant horizon. And somewhere beyond this city, another young woman, one who had been told she was too much or not enough, would see Amara's work and recognize something of herself. A new constellation would be born. Because this is how power moves when it's real. Not in explosions, but in echoes. If her journey has whispered to something inside you, if you've ever felt unseen but knew you were meant for more, remember this. You don't need anyone's permission to build your own empire. You just need your hands, your voice, and the audacity to keep creating. Like, comment, and follow to keep walking with Amara's story, because every stitch, every choice, every small rebellion adds up to something luminous, and your story might be next.